Thank you for joining us at the Evolution of Medicine Summit. A warm welcome. We wanted to make a specific thank you to our sponsors that have made this event possible. Energetics, an innovative natural remedy and supplement company, is committed to revitalizing medicine, and Cyrex Labs, a clinical immunology laboratory specializing in functional immunology and autoimmunity. Most of all, thank you for listening. If you'd like to share this with your colleagues and friends on Facebook if you enjoy the content, and if you have questions, you can ask us on Twitter with the hashtag EvoMed. Finally, if you really want to play your part in accelerating the evolution of medicine, ask your doctor if the Evolution of Medicine Summit might be right for them. Thank you and enjoy. Hello and welcome back to the Evolution of Medicine Summit. I am very excited to introduce you to my next guest for this talk, the evolution of oncology. Certainly a topic that I'm particularly passionate and interested about. My mother is a breast cancer survivor, and cancer is a huge issue. Today I have Dr. Lise Alschuler, who is a naturopathic oncologist. And while that term might not be that familiar to some of you, maybe that's a great place for us to start, Doctor. Thanks so much for being on, by the way. It's great to have you here today, and I really appreciate you making time to be part of the summit.
Well, I'm delighted to be a part of the summit. I'm looking forward to this conversation as well.
So I guess the first question I would have to ask you is, why is it relevant for me to be talking to a naturopath about the evolution of oncology?
Yeah, that's a great starting question. So oncology is a tremendously shifting field. It's there's so many ways that we could talk about this, and hopefully we'll touch on several of them. But one thing that we know now is that cancer is not just a disease of genetic mutations that we inherit from our parents. It used to be thought that it was simply a genetic mutation that would march itself forward into developing a tumor, and that led to all the therapies that we now consider as anti-cancer therapies that basically are directed against that tumor, targeting that tumor and trying to destroy it. And those therapies are certainly effective in many regards, and they have, I think, saved many lives and prolonged other lives. But the reality is that we now understand that cancer is a much more complex phenomenon, and it results not just from genetic mutations. In fact, the true what are called germline mutations, or mutations that are inherited from, our ancestors, account for at best 10% of all cancers, and that's when you include breast cancer. But when you take breast cancer out, it's about 5% of all cancers. So what that means is that 90 to 95% of all cancers are acquired during our lifetime, and it's that acquisition that has really led to, I think, the new discoveries in our understanding about cancer, because we now know that cancer results as a result of the environment in which the tumor grows as much as the changes within the tumor cells themselves. And it's that interplay between the milieu of the body and the signals and the information that cells are sending to each other, and the result inside a cell that becomes transformed or carcinogenic. And that interaction right there is really where the future of oncology is. And that's why asking this question to a naturopathic doctor is relevant, because naturopathic medicine has, from its origins, focused on the milieu, changing the soil where the plants grow. So it's basically all about trying to understand and to modify, manipulate the milieu, the environment of the tissue, to disfavor cancer growth and instead to support health and well-being.
That's really interesting and very well put. So for those doctors who are on the line, maybe some oncologists who are listening, who are not familiar with those naturopathic principles that you're talking about, can you just share like some of the naturopathic principles that start and how they apply to this type of epigenetic condition?
Sure, yeah. So basically the, kind of keeping it within the context of cancer, this whole concept within oncology is called the tissue organization field theory, which essentially proposes that cancer is a tissue-based disease and that it arises from the disruption of tissue microarchitecture, and that when that disruption is long-standing, then we get genetic instability, we get altered epigenetic signaling patterns, we get further mutational changes, and then we get this expansion of the cell line that ultimately results in a tumor. So, from a naturopathic standpoint, naturopathic doctors focus a lot on trying to understand, first of all, the cause of disease. So, we really search hard. The oft given example is when people come in with a headache, it's not because they're lacking ibuprofen. It's because there's something else at root or at cause of that inflammatory reaction. So we would look and investigate digestive function and try to understand whether there's inflammation or dysbiosis in the gut contributing to an autoimmune type of reaction, whether there are nutrient deficiencies contributing to vasculature abnormalities, whether there are cognition issues related to blood flow in the brain, etc. So we try to really drill down and treat the cause as much as possible. So in this context, the cause would then be the tissue microarchitecture and trying to understand what's gone wrong in that's allowed these aberrant signaling mechanisms to take place. Another really key naturopathic principle along these lines is to use the most natural means possible to stimulate the innate healing capacity of the body. And that's a very important concept, because that means that naturopathic doctors believe that there is an inherent healing capacity within each individual, which is a very strong philosophical stance to take. So it means we don't see ourselves as rescuers coming in to rescue somebody from their pathology, but rather we see ourselves as facilitators of somebody's innate healing capacity. In the case of cancer, that means really, again, trying to facilitate their body environment to try to make it as inhospitable to cancer as possible.
That makes so much sense to me. I mean, I definitely get that. So when you look at this situation and take a step back, you said you were looking really at the causes. If we look at the research that's being done since we understood that there was an epigenetic source to a lot of cancers, what are you seeing as the major trends in the research of what is at the cause of most of these cancers? And is it different for where the cancer actually manifests, which organ or system?
It is a little bit different per cancer type, but if you kind of imagine a pie graph, and you take, let's give it 10% chunk out for inherited genetic mutations, a 30% chunk would be attributed to diet. So diet is increasingly recognized as a significant contributor to cancer development, and that has both to do with the overall kind of macronutrient aspect of the diet, as well as micronutrient deficiencies and excesses. Another big chunk to that is infections and the inflammation that they instigate, in many cases in a chronic manner. Another growing, and pun intended, chunk of that is obesity. Obesity is now recognized as the cause of 1 in every 5 cancer diagnoses. And then there's kind of a smattering of other issues, including environmental issues. Primarily, we're talking about pollutants. Those are a little harder to nail down in a cause and effect relationship, but in terms of correlation, there are increasingly strong correlations between certain environmental toxicants and cancer development.
Wow, that's pretty clear. So it seems like one of the things that I see is that oncologists are generally called in way too late, right? We've already been going. I've heard that pancreatic cancer is maybe developing for 20 years before it even gets big enough to be seen in a certain situation so that it can be dealt with. And it sounds like what you're talking about is like we need to really, part of this evolution of oncology is to catch things further up the train, not necessarily by seeing it because we won't be able to see it, but by changing some of these epigenetic factors, some of these factors that affect health.
Yeah, absolutely. So first I want to just acknowledge what you just said, because oncologists have a tremendously difficult job. They're dealt with cancer when it's well committed down its path. And although the tools they have at their disposal are for the most part fairly crude and toxic, chemotherapy, radiation, they are effective, and their job is really difficult. So I just want to really acknowledge the challenge that's facing oncologists. And, I think that one of the things I would also say is that naturopathic medicine is very much about integrative oncology. So we recognize the value and the importance of these conventional approaches, but also believe that that's not enough by itself, and that we need to kind of roll this back and include all sorts of other modalities. So to kind of address your point, though, clearly this all makes the most sense if we think about this from true primary prevention. And cancer diagnoses are just going crazy. Unfortunately, there is, in 2012 there were about 1.6 million new cancers diagnosed around the world, and that is expected to increase by 45% over the next 20 years. That's just astonishing. So much so that recently the World Cancer Research Foundation describe this as an impending disaster. And so we can't treat all that cancer. That's not the answer. The answer is prevention. So yes, in many respects, prevention is definitely where we're at. But prevention is relevant for somebody who's been diagnosed. Somebody who's been diagnosed, assuming they meet successful tumor eradication therapy, are then squarely on the path, or should be squarely on the path, of prevention of recurrence. So it's really relevant along this continuum of cancer care.
That's really interesting. So let's just talk a little bit about the practicality of effective cancer care with this understanding. So, if you look at the landscape in America now, who is doing a good job at this integrative oncology, and what does that look like?
Well, that's another good question. So the integrative oncology is a little bit challenging. The vast majority of oncology cancer centers do not include a lot of integrative oncology. That's changing a bit. Most of the cancer centers that do have any inclination to include integrative oncology have included yoga, for example, perhaps some meditation classes, maybe have an acupuncturist on staff, or at least a referral to somebody in the community for acupuncture. So some things like that. What still is not really included, and frankly, what I spend most of my time in working with people with this diagnosis, is really dealing with this in the biological sense. So working with people's diets, suggesting dietary supplement regimens. That area of integrative oncology is still not well embraced by conventional oncologists. So most patients then become their own advocate, really, and they have to seek out all components of care that they wish to integrate. There are very few places. I think Cancer Treatment Centers of America is probably the only one I know of that really has systematized an integrative model. But the rest of people that are getting treatment elsewhere have to get their conventional care through their oncologist, and then have to seek out somebody like a naturopathic oncologist, or an integrative or alternative minded medical doctor that has experience and training in oncology. So it's a challenge, frankly, for patients, but a lot of patients are doing it. The average dietary supplement used, for example, just across the general population, in terms of regular supplement use, it's about 30% or so. When you talk about people with a diagnosis of cancer, that usage rate goes up to over 80%, in some studies upwards of 95%. So people are clearly interested in integrating and are trying to figure out how to do this well.
Sure. So for doctors who are listening that don't know about supplements, or maybe skeptical about supplements and cancer, I could think that you might think that this is just sort of desperation. What are the supplements that have a proven efficacy or have supportive properties during cancer care?
Oh gosh, there's so many. That's the thing, this is so depending on the level of evidence that you would determine qualifies something as being an evidence-based therapy, there maybe is a handful of truly evidence-based therapies if you use the highest tier of evidence. But if you talk about an evidence-informed therapy, which is a therapy that has clinical research behind it, that has good theoretical sort of basis for its use, that has some safety data done on it, and that the benefit-risk ratio is favorable. In that case, then there's actually hundreds of integrative therapies that are useful, and they're useful at various points along this continuum. So, for example, we now know that green tea and one of its components, epigallocatechin gallate, which has a long and varied epidemiological justification for its cancer prevention, also now has several clinical trials demonstrating its benefit in both the active treatment or cancer control, like, for example, in various forms of leukemia and myeloma, as well as and lymphoma, as well as prevention of recurrence, like with breast cancer. That would be one therapy. Then if we kind of move forward into the continuum of active co-management, so helping people tolerate their conventional treatment more effectively so that they can sustain the full dose, the full course, kind of go the whole way. There's a whole slew of other therapies that are very specific to the specific conventional treatment being used. So for example, glutamine might be useful with a taxane chemotherapy to reduce the neuropathy. And then there's the last part of the continuum, which is prevention of recurrence, and that brings up a whole new set of evidence-informed therapy. So there's actually a lot out there.
That's great. So some of the therapies are for use with, for the cancer itself. Some of them are to help with the other interventions that you might be doing, like chemotherapy and radiation. So let's start right at the top of the tree at what are some of the interventions that a naturopathic oncologist might recommend that are extremely evidence-based, have a ton of science, and if oncologists were listening, would be just sort of like the easiest and most obvious and most scientifically backed thing to do or to start doing?
Well, I think, one certainly is green tea and green tea extracts that are concentrated to their epigallocatechin gallate or EGCG component. As I mentioned, there are a number of epidemiological trials which clearly show a lower risk of cancer in all different cancer types. We now know that as well, there are instances where the use of green tea, for example, in women who have been diagnosed with early stage breast cancer, who have been through first-line therapy, so surgery and subsequent chemotherapy or radiation, those that consume green tea. And, we're talking about, if you're just drinking the green tea, we're talking about an average consumption of 5 to 8 small, Japanese-sized cups a day, that at that rate of consumption, they lower their risk of recurrence in these studies on average about 27%. So that's certainly something that most naturopathic oncologists will consider, at least in that population. There is quite a number. There's over 400 clinical trials on a substance called melatonin and cancer. And melatonin is it's a hormone that we produce, obviously, but we produce it in fairly small amounts when you take it exogenously as a dietary supplement in a much higher amount, and all these studies for the most part have used 20 milligrams of melatonin as the study dose. Then you see a tremendous increase in overall survival, disease-free survival for all different cancer types when people are taking melatonin concurrent with various types of chemotherapy. There has been a trial on people with glioblastoma receiving radiation therapy, and that adding melatonin, again, increases overall survival significantly over just the radiation alone. So that's a big one. I guess the other one I would just mention quickly is medicinal mushrooms, particularly those that have what's called PSK or polysaccharide crestin in it. This is a derivative basically of Trametes versicolor or turkey tail mushroom. And there's been so much clinical data that's so strong, most of which has been done in Asia, that in Japan using PSK is now part of conventional care, actually. And in a recent meta-analysis, they went through various clinical trials and basically came up with a number needed to treat of 11 to get a significantly enhanced 5-year overall disease-free survival rate. So that's very strong data. So those are some of the, I would say, go-tos, if you will, from a naturopathic oncology perspective.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And one thing that is rife in cancer care understanding is things that are legal or used in other countries that aren't used in America. You hear people going to Mexico for cancer care and so forth, and you just mentioned things in Japan that are standard of care that aren't here. Are there things that, in your opinion, are effective and proven that are not available in America that should be used from your experience or from the research that you're seeing?
I would say that there are some therapies that I have my eye on, and because I practice in the United States, I'm actually not as well versed in the true veracity of the claims around the effectiveness of a lot of these therapies. But for example, one that comes to mind is the use of hyperthermia, which is been studied and in pretty widespread use, I would say, throughout Europe. And it's now just beginning to infiltrate into the United States, but it requires quite a lot of rigmarole to get the allowance to offer hyperthermia. But hyperthermia with this it's now very sophisticated, with very sophisticated machines to deliver very deep heating. That hyperthermia, again, in conjunction with a lot of these conventional therapies, stimulates the anti-tumor response of those therapies, stimulates immunity, so it helps to protect people while they're going through treatment. And the research is quite compelling. So that's something that, as an example, would be some of my colleagues in Canada are using it, and certainly would like to see more of that in the US.
Absolutely. You mentioned then just the engaging the anti-cancer response, or the innate response in the body. You talked about the innate response earlier. You've spoken a lot about substances there that do that. Outside of substances, what are there things that are being proven to be effective outside of just biochemistry?
My mind works that I like to understand something on sort of a global level, but then I like to get down and really figure out the mechanism of action on a biological or molecular level. So having said that, things that are clearly probably among the two most impactful strategies in terms of both cancer control as well as prevention would be exercise and stress management. So exercise has emerged in terms of the evidence base quite significantly over the last 10 years or so, and so much so that, for example, if a woman who's been diagnosed with breast cancer, if she increases her physical activity after her diagnosis, she lowers her risk of death by 45%. On the other hand, if she's diagnosed and then she stops exercising, she becomes sedentary, she increases her risk of dying fourfold.
Wow.
I mean, that's just tremendous. And that's been seen now in colon cancer, in prostate cancer, and even now in some other cancers as well. So exercise is, why? Let me just be frank. Why not all oncologists are having conversations with their patients about exercise is perplexing to me, because it, from a statistical perspective, is quite impactful, more impactful than many of the treatments that we have available to us. So that's a biggie.
Well, that is huge. That's crazy. So you said exercise. What about the stress management? Is there similar types of numbers on that?
Well, so stress management is not quite as compelling from a statistical standpoint, but when you look at it mechanistically, it's quite fascinating. So there's a large body of evidence looking at the relationship between stress and cancer progression and also initial diagnosis. And we know that severe stress, like divorce or death of a loved one, results in a significantly increased risk of cancer in the next period of time, like 1 to 5 years. So we know that there's an impact of significant stress. But if you kind of pull back from that, what you see is a very clear correlation between chronic stress and increased risk of cancer progression. And we now know more about why that's true. And just as one example of that, there are many ways, many pathways of stress to tumorigenesis or to cancer development. But as one kind of interesting one, there are these protective caps on the end of our chromosomes called telomeres. Telomeres become abnormally shortened in cancerous cells, and that is one of the characteristics of lending them instability. Now, interestingly, as cancers progress, they actually upregulate the enzyme which adds the length back to their telomeres, so it kind of regains their immortality. But in that kind of initial period where somebody maybe has been through treatment, they're supposedly cancer-free, they're trying to prevent recurrence, the key is to make sure those telomeres are long, so that their chromosomes are stable. And we know that's true from several other trials published in New England Journal of Medicine, things like that. So we want strong, long telomeres in order to prevent cancer progression. And as it turns out, when people are exposed to a lot of stress, and particularly when they respond to that stress with a sense of pessimism and hopelessness, those two emotions in particular, their telomeres are abnormally short, and their telomerase enzyme becomes inactive. So we know that kind of emotional mood state as a result of stress has chromosomal impacts. And there are, as I said, many other pathways that have nothing to do with chromosomes per se, but have to do with cell signaling. Stress, for example, when we're under chronic stress, we have upregulated production of cortisol and norepinephrine. And a lot of cancer cells have receptors for both of those hormones, particularly norepinephrine. And when norepinephrine binds to a cancer cell, it actually stimulates proliferation of that cell. So stress becomes a direct growth factor, in fact, to cancer cells. So it's, quite fascinating from a mechanistic perspective, and I think something that a lot of people that have been diagnosed with cancer really resonate with. They recognize the deleterious effects of stress and are really seeking ways to manage that in their lives.
So out of all of the stress management tools, therapies, all the things that are out there, is there good science on some of them? If an oncologist is listening and they're looking to, maybe bring in a practitioner or bring in something to the office, what would be the sort of percentage move for them?
Well, I think that's why we see some of these cancer centers opening places where people can learn how to do guided meditation. There's a lot of data on mindfulness-based stress reduction through meditation practices and lowering the risk of inflammatory markers and, in fact, lowering the risk of cancer progression. So I think that's really a very clearly effective, low-risk therapy. There's also a good body of data in this realm on yoga and using yoga as a stress management technique. And again, you see that. So cancer centers many of them have actually created an opportunity for people to learn how to do yoga. So yeah, I think those would be probably two kind of entry points, if you will.
Yeah, and so easy to do, and patients love it, and it's adding value to the relationship that you have with patients. So it sounds like that would be sort of an easy thing to do. So now, just for all the sort of skeptics who are there, I know I've heard yourself and others speak at different conventions. Just so we're clear, doing yoga and drinking a bunch of green tea is not if you get a diagnosis of cancer, is that the percentage move for you, or should you be integrating it with the current therapies that you have right now? Because I think this is an important point as well.
Very much so, yeah. So, I'll answer this from a very personal perspective. So I was diagnosed with breast cancer myself 5 years ago, and I went through surgery, chemotherapy, because of certain characteristics of my own tumor, and radiation therapy. I'm almost finished now with tamoxifen. So I did the full-on conventional treatment plan, but at the same time, throughout that, I employed all of the things I talked to my patients about. So, I had an exercise program, I had a dietary program, I had a dietary supplement program. I made a lot of significant life changes to balance my stress. And one of the things I would say as a result of that is, hopefully, knock on wood, I'm still cancer-free, so to speak, but perhaps more importantly, throughout that time, I always felt like a healthy person getting chemotherapy, a healthy person getting radiation, so that I was very much supporting the milieu of my body to tolerate those treatments more effectively. I also feel very strongly that as a result of that integrative approach, I've maximized both the tumor kill that needed to happen, but at the same time changed some of the pathways in my body that would otherwise make it easier for cancer to regrow. And so my hope is that with that approach, I will have maximized my chances for long-term disease-free survival. Now, all of this is, of course, risk reduction. So, as I heard an analogy the other day, we can get in the car, we can put on our seatbelt, we can check our side mirrors, we can do everything to drive safe, and we still might get in an accident. So it's not going to guarantee no cancer, but it's going to set me up to minimize that eventuality or that potentiality.
Was this fire to understand naturopathic oncology burning in you before your diagnosis, or has this happened as a result of it?
Way back when, over 20 years ago, when I was in undergraduate school, I was headed towards conventional medical school because I wanted to become an oncologist. So I was always interested in cancer care, and along the way, actually, my foot was literally on the threshold of starting conventional medical school, and I heard about naturopathic school, so I sort of took a diversion, which I'm very happy that I did. But yeah, my interest has been long-standing. I think there's something about cancer that, as a diagnosis, that is truly a life-transformative event. People, more than any other illness, because I practiced general medicine for about 10 years before I went into oncology. Now I just do oncology, naturopathic oncology. And I really can say that cancer, when people are diagnosed with cancer, it's like they kind of all of a sudden they've walked right up to the mirror and they're staring at themselves and their own mortality in a very clear and very intimate way. And as a result of that, they do some pretty deep reevaluation of their priorities, why they want to live, why they want to fight, what's important, what they're willing to do and not do. And so being a clinician and working with people that have gone to that level of self-assessment is tremendously gratifying. So I really enjoy this specialty. I enjoy very much the people that I work with. And my own experience has just added sort of an authenticity to my work, but certainly was not the primary motivator.
That is an amazing thing to say. In fact, I've got something that I want to drop on you right now, and I want to get your input on it. My mother, when she was diagnosed, she saw a naturopath in England, which has become harder and harder in the last few years with the changes in the supplement laws there. But she said after she went to see it, she went through this process, she said that ignorance was the disease and cancer was the cure. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's powerful. And it's so true. And I just, and it comes to people in different ways, but it's always, tremendously transformative on a very deep, deep level. And I actually, in my work with patients and in my educational work to consumers, I really talk about using cancer as an experience to get to a point of exuberant living. And I choose that word with respects to my father, who was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer before I was diagnosed with breast cancer. He outlived his 3-month prognosis significantly. He ended up passing away 17 months after his diagnosis, employing a truly integrative approach, felt exceptionally well, better than he had actually prior to his diagnosis. But he would talk about how he was actually living each day as if he was dying, or he would say he was living with his eyes wide open. And what he meant by that was really raking in every day's experience so that he could truly live an exuberant life. And so I've kind of taken that from him as my motto and really try to inculcate that in patients as well.
That's very powerful. Well, thank you for sharing that. So let's take a different look at this from a cancer care point of view, from the care that people are getting. What's your views and thoughts on cancer care in America and the evolution of oncology, the direction that this needs to go or is going?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors kind of playing into this. So for one, oncologists are really finding themselves in a very challenging position now because the rate of new drug development is accelerating tremendously because we're moving into these very precise biologically based therapies and kind of away from chemotherapy. So it used to be that oncologists basically had several regimens that they knew and they knew well, but now they have to learn new drugs, sometimes one a month, couple a month. It's very complicated. These are not easy drugs, often have a lot of side effects. So it's becoming more complex from the perspective of the oncologist, which also makes it more challenging for the patient because the patient is often given several choices, none of which are very clear in terms of the right answer. So it's like a world of gray instead of black and white. So everybody's kind of thrown into this challenging kind of lots of options situation. And then if you throw on top of that some of the other issues that people with this diagnosis are dealing with, the psychological aspect of being diagnosed with cancer, there's, lots of depression and anxiety that can occur. As a result, there's tremendous disruption to one's life in terms of sometimes people have to take a leave of absence from work, so then they get into employment issues and financial issues. There are issues with body, depending on the kind of surgeries or disfigurement from the cancer. So there's body image issues, there's relationship issues. There's just a lot that gets kind of tossed up into the air. And the financial, just to go back to that, the financial burdens of this disease are tremendous. People, assuming they have insurance, which is not true for everybody, the average cost of people going through chemotherapy is about $100,000 a year. And people's copays range significantly. Some have to pay significant dollars for every treatment that they get. So this is a very expensive disease. And, I've had patients who are struggling to maintain their conventional therapy and who've put second mortgages on their homes or taken, loans out to just try to cover their care. So this can become very financial financially challenging for people. And then on top of that, now we throw in this kind of concept of people have this disease in there, and many of them are like, I want to do whatever it takes to get well. So they have to now kind of go out into the world and find an integrative provider who's skilled and able to work with them to support that part of their care while they're also getting the conventional care. So putting all that together, you get kind of a complicated, challenging situation. So with that in mind, what I say is there are several things that need to happen in terms of how we can transform cancer care. Number one, we really need to look at the cost of care and see what we can do to make this more affordable for people. Number two, I think we need to come up with a wider berth of accepted therapies and to bring to the same table a care team with the patient really as the focus, so that we're treating people, not just diseases, and that different provider types are actually working together and coordinating their care plans together for the benefit of the patient. Just kind of take that off the table for patients. And then I think really addressing the emotional burden of this disease is important and not addressed enough. And I think that bringing our psychotherapists and our social workers and anybody who has training in facilitating insight and coping strategies is a really critical part of people's experience with cancer. And I think those are just, some initial steps. But if we can get at least that in place in more places than not, then we'll kind of start to set a framework for much more substantive and holistic and truly empowering care.
That sounds like a good strategy to me, and certainly seems to make a lot of sense, because a lot of these strategies that you're talking about are really free to deliver. I mean, in a certain way, it's almost like we're using the most expensive ones, but exercise, which is free and easy, is not being used, and the percentages are extremely valuable there. So if you had the purse strings, if you would put yourself in, say, the seat of Mark Bertolini, the CEO of Aetna, and you're looking to reform cancer care in America and looking to take a new road, what would be some of the sort of starting points that you could see doing if you had your magic wand?
I love that question. Well, I think I would actually start in a couple of different ways. Number one, I would actually require, as part of my provider credentialing program, that all providers that are doing primary care get extra training in oncology, and specifically related to not only signs and symptoms of early cancer and screening, but also prevention. Because this disease will get the better of us unless we do more to prevent it. And that starts really when people are children, and throughout their lifespan. And I think that if we can get primary care providers on board with that, then we actually have a chance to start to change the tide of this illness. And that's particularly relevant given the fact that we're living on average longer, and so we have more time to develop cancer. So I think that's like one of the things I would do for sure, is make sure that primary care providers are well versed in cancer prevention and get rewarded for including cancer prevention strategies, which are basic stuff. Specific dietary strategies, and there's good evidence around that, Mediterranean type of diet, really getting them educated about what that diet is and isn't, exercise, stress management, just basic stuff that's going to have implications for all disease. The next thing I would do is to look at the oncology centers and to try to find and place different provider types into those settings, so that we have naturopathic oncologists, we have dietitians and or nutritionists, we have acupuncturists, we have psychologists, all working together in a collaborative team environment, and again build incentives to that collaboration so that patients can truly, in a non-judgmental, non-antagonistic manner, receive of truly multidisciplinary care. And that's where I would start, with those two things.
That sounds like a great starting point. One thing that you become aware of every October in America is that there's not really a lack of knowledge about cancer and a lack of awareness. We have things like Susan G. Komen and otherwise. We have these huge organizations that are dedicated to letting people know about cancer and the awareness. Those companies have a lot of responsibility and make a lot of money from this, from this field. Do you think that they could have a more benevolent role to play in helping with some of this stuff? Because it seems like they're in a perfect position to do it. I just don't see them doing any of that. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Like, I'm only one pink KFC bucket away from thinking that the whole thing is a scam. So what would you say to those groups as well that obviously have cancer at the source, are engaging a lot of people to talk about cancer, but don't really seem to be aware of any of this kind of stuff? And it seems like they could play a role in, if we're actually going to talk about cancer, and if we're actually going to talk about getting the word out about some of these epigenetic ways that we can affect change. What role do you think that they could be playing more to make some significant change?
Yeah, and so what these organizations have done is taken the words breast cancer from being, hush hush to being very comfortably spoken about on national television. So, that's significant and that's important. And I think that's a solid first step. And I agree that we need to take this solid next step, which is in addition to devoting dollars to treatments, because I do think that we still need to discover more precise and more effective treatments. But we also need to devote a significant amount of dollars to not only researching more preventive strategies and getting a stronger cause and effect established, but we also need to devote a certain amount of dollars to oncology centers so that they have the tools and the training and the setup to actually implement these strategies, so that so if we sort of step back and we say, okay, we're going to actually have some common theoretical understandings now. We're going to accept the notion that cancer is more than a disease of genetic mutation, that it is influenced by epigenetics, that it's influenced by signal transduction, from the milieu of our body, and that there is therefore, given all of that, a role for non-medical therapies and for lifestyle changes in patients throughout the continuum of their care. So if we kind of step back and say, okay, this is our new foundation of understanding, then from there we can start to devote some of these dollars and awareness to therapies that I think really start to shift this growing specter of cancer in our lives and around our globe. So yeah, and it's hard, they're not as sexy as the cure, finding the cure for cancer, getting people to, run for 3 days just because they're going to help other people learn how to eat better and lose weight and sleep more. That's just not quite as sexy, but we've just really got to get our minds around that and focus that way nonetheless.
Well, given the effect of exercise, you could see that, even the work that they're doing, the run for the cure and walk for the cure is valuable, and I think if they could just communicate more of that, I think that would be a great starting point. And, I think the money too could be a lot better used, but I'm glad to have an opportunity to discuss that because, that's obviously a phenomenon that has grown leaps and bounds in the last 10 years. And I agree with you, some of the guilt and shame of a cancer diagnosis has sort of been wiped away, which I think is a great starting point. But I think we've still got a long way to go in terms of doing the right thing at the right time to prevent this.
Yeah, and if I could just add one other thing on to that, I had a patient the other day who was getting her chemotherapy, and she's been through this before. She's got recurrent disease, and she's just now, with this recurrence, investigating incorporating naturopathic oncology. And so she's been learning a tremendous amount about her diet and the impact that her diet has on her body and her disease process, her immune system, her inflammatory system, her insulin resistance, all of which we know are associated with carcinogenesis. So she's just learning all these things. She's very excited about it. She goes in to get her chemo, and they're walking around with candy treats, there's donuts, there's soda pop, and there's not a vegetable in sight. And for her, she described this as not only strange and confusing, but it actually made her angry. And she was like, wow, I'm here. I'm spending my money, my time getting this therapy, and I'm not getting any reinforcement for all of the work I'm doing outside of this treatment center. And I think that that's kind of just for me an interesting visual, and I think an important takeaway, if you will, of another place that we can integrate. I mean, this is, changing people's minds and understanding of this could be as simple as just changing the environment of chemotherapy infusion centers and the kind of food that's available to people, the kind of people that walk around. Maybe we have dietitians walking around talking to people about the benefits of vegetables or something like that.
Yeah. Well, let's go a bit further into diet, because that's something that really covers both angles. Because I know, this is mainly for doctors, what we're talking about today, but I know that a lot of patients, especially patients who have loved ones with cancer or a new diagnosis or otherwise, are probably, looking at this and saying, hey, what can we do? Let's talk a little bit about diet, because first of all, you've spoken about, are there certain foods and strategies that are proving effective when it comes to prevention or support of the treatment? I've certainly heard some buzzwords. We hear a little bit about cruciferous vegetables and some of the properties of those. We also hear a lot about like the ketogenic diet. I'm hearing more and more about with regard to cancer. What's the truth? What are the myths? What are the half-truths? And what do we sort of what's the evolution of diet and cancer look like?
Yeah, so there's a lot of opinions about there, and a lot of fanatics, I should say, about various dietary approaches. What I can say is that if you look at where is most of the research, and what do all of these various approaches have in common, if anything, then you come up, fortunately in this case, with the same answer, and that's a plant-based diet. It's very hard to argue against the health impacts of a plant-based diet, and what I mean by that is it basically kind of along the lines of a Mediterranean diet, or perhaps a Mediterranean-style diet adapted to the cultural or ethnic background of the person. So a diet that's whole unprocessed foods, that 5 to 10 servings of primarily vegetables, but also fruit, some whole grains. Grass-fed land meat is fine. Cold water, deep sea fish is fine. Nuts, seeds, those kind of things. That diet has been well documented to be correlated with a decreased risk of developing cancer and decreasing the risk of cancer recurrence, as well as improving people's outcome during treatment. So it impacts all phases of the cancer continuum. And we also now have a strong and deep body of data that gives us the mechanisms for why plant-based diets are so impactful. And it, as you would imagine, impacts the tissue milieu, and therefore the signaling that cancer cells are getting from the surrounding tissues. It influences cancer cells on an epigenetic basis, changing methylation patterns on the DNA. It influences the immune system, polarizing the immune system towards a Th1 dominant response or a cytotoxic dominant response. It impacts insulin resistance, which is insulin resistance characterized with high levels of circulating insulin, and its compadre, insulin growth factor 1, are increasingly linked to increased risk of cancer progression and actually initial cancer in many cancer types, notably colon and breast cancer. And we know diet is probably the most important strategy to affect or reverse insulin resistance. And then I talked about stress earlier, and we know that diet impacts our resistance to stress, actually, and changes the way in which our stress axis, our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, communicates to the stressors that we encounter. So, I mean, there's just, I always come back to that diet. If you kind of go from that and the various branches that come off of that basic plant-based Mediterranean style diet, you get these, intermittent fasting diets, the ketogenic diet, the paleo diet. They all have various, I feel, appropriate times where they might be more useful and might drive a certain process. And I think that can be employed in in an individualized format. But if I was to just kind of step back and say, well, if I want to cast the widest net and get the most bang for my buck, what do? It's definitely a plant-based Mediterranean diet.
Well, I think that's a good starting point for everyone, and I'm sure the controversy and fanaticism will continue, but I think that's a great overview. I guess the last thing I want to talk about, Doctor, with you today is my background is really as an economist. I was trained as an economist, and one of the things, the concepts of economics, which I think is really relevant here, is this concept of externalities. Now, when you look at externalities in general, you think of, when you're giving a textbook definition, we talk about, say, something like pollution. So, pollution, let's say the city of Beijing. There's been commerce in the city of Beijing for hundreds, thousands of years, and for a long time, people could have fires in their house, and certainly towards the last century, start to build infrastructure and industry, and the air was breathable, and things were fine, and basically no one was paying the cost of that pollution. Now you get to a point where those pollutants and those externalities are so large that now it's playing a role in the health of Chinese people. I saw some statistics the other day just about how many people it's killing and the air pollution and so forth. And, we can see this to a greater or lesser extent all over the world. In the 50s, when my dad lived in London, they used to have these things called the pea supers, where they would have pollution, they would have the coal burning power stations, and you'd have ridiculous pollution, and then they stopped that and things cleared up. So, the reason I bring this up is because you mentioned at the beginning toxicity in the human body, and possibly playing a role in cancer, probably more like probably rather than possibly, but we don't really understand the mechanism. But could you just talk a little bit on that? Because I'm really passionate and interested about this, because I see the correlation from economics to the human body, and this is really, to me, the embodiment of holism. The earth is just a whole system, and it has a feedback loop. The body is the same thing, and it seems to me that pollution in the body, whether it takes the form of industrial pollutants or chemicals or pesticides, or whether it be stuff from the food or otherwise, these are things that possibly lay dormant for a bit of time. They don't have an effect until suddenly you reach a certain amount, and then they do. To me, this makes a lot of sense for the genesis of cancer, but it's definitely, by their very nature, these externalities are hard to measure. Is there more that we could be doing to thinking in this way? And what are some strategies if we feel like that is something that is happening, and yet we realize that we may not be able to quantify it just by the nature of how it happens? Are there strategies that we can be taking now, or what do you think of that whole thing as a premise?
Yeah, I sort of inadvertently de-emphasized toxicity and detoxification, and that was not intentful, because the reality is that environmental toxins are clearly correlated with cancer development, and the mechanisms we are beginning to understand. We know, for example, that exposure to environmental toxins causes what's called DNA adducts, which are these abnormal bridges between one chromosome to another, and when the cell divides, then the number of chromosomes that are given to their daughter cells are abnormal, because the chromosomes tear at the site of those bridges, and that develops into aneuploidy, which is an abnormal number of chromosomes characteristic of tumors. So we know that there's a direct link in terms of toxin exposure, DNA adduct formation, aneuploidy, which really is almost definitional of cancer. We also know that environmental pollutants change epigenetics. So we know that environmental pollutants change the expression of various genes. For example, tobacco smoke, which I also forgot to mention as one of the main causes of cancer, but still is up there, we know increases the expression of many actually genes, including something called cytochrome 1b1, which is a cytochrome detoxification enzyme that's upregulated in response to cigarette smoke to metabolize it and to break it down. But as it turns out, CYP1B1 also metabolizes, for example, estradiol into its most carcinogenic metabolites, its quinones ultimately. And so when you have cigarette smoke, you epigenetically upregulate 1B1, and then you have a pathway now for making estrogen in the body more carcinogenic. So these are some of the mechanisms that we now know. So given all that, yeah, it makes a lot of sense to pay attention to the toxicity of our world and to consider either having individual assessment for toxic load, whether it's perhaps heavy metal testing or looking at tissue levels of certain other biological contaminants, and then clearly engaging in what I consider to be gentle detoxification. So living a lifestyle that will gently and daily encourage detoxification processes within the body. This is from a naturopathic perspective, a very liver supportive lifestyle. This is taking in foods that stimulate detoxification pathways, that replete antioxidants, which are really critical in a phase of detoxification. This means avoiding known toxicants as much as possible, minimizing, of course, exposure to things like cigarette smoke. Then this also means using, again, dietary supplementation or perhaps even just kind of focusing in the diet on foods that have detoxification supportive properties. You mentioned broccoli earlier. That's a great example because broccoli has compounds in it which epigenetically upregulate NRF2 enzymes, and these are enzymes which code for other antioxidants. So when we eat broccoli, we tell the gene that activates NRF2 to be active, and we get more antioxidant capacity. So the more we eat broccoli, the more that's going to happen. So I think that there are clearly daily strategies that we can employ to increase our defenses and in that way minimize the carcinogenic impact of the environment. That being said, this is also perhaps why somebody who's been exercising their whole life, eating organically, taking in lots of plants every day, managing their stress, still get cancer because, that we live in an increasingly toxic environment. What can we do ultimately?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a big point. And I've certainly seen, one of the strategies one of my doctor friends told me as he saw was no purchase toxins. He was like, look, you're going to get in contact with toxins anyway from your day-to-day life, breathing in, being in certain environments. But it sounds like we, from my perspective, we really have a lot of control about how many toxins we buy, whether it be personal care products or cleaning products or those kind of things. And ultimately, it seems like, even though we only vote once every 4 years, we could sort of be voting for cancer or otherwise just with the products that we're buying every day.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and absolutely. And that helps it from being a completely overwhelming situation to something that is empowering, because we absolutely can change what we use in our homes. We can change what we wear on our bodies, what we drive in, and all of these things that we have regular contact in can either be more or less toxic, and we can certainly make choices. And the more choices we make along those lines, that's where things change. When the consumer buying patterns change and shift towards preferring these lesser toxic or non-toxic items, the industry will change as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really valuable. And the last thing I want to ask you, because one of the other things that we're talking about here is, is we're talking about this sort of the upcoming sort of digital disruption that's happening in medicine. One of the things that I see is going to happen is that we're going to have a lot more ability to measure causative factors a lot further up the food chain and be able to see those kind of things. I think it's only just getting started with like how many steps a day you're taking or your heart rate and so forth. But, once we have the iWatch and, people are building apps on top of that, I will see that, we'll be able to get a lot more upstream information. If you are someone who's passionate about cancer and getting rid of cancer and you're in the tech world, what would be the kind of things that you'd want to be measuring ahead of time to be able to catch the causative factors of and preventing cancer most effectively?
Yeah, that's a nice question too. Well, I think many of the things you mentioned. So absolutely measuring activity. There's some good data now that shows it's not just going out and doing dedicated exercise for a half hour, an hour a day, but it's actually also not being sedentary for the remainder of the day that has tremendous cancer preventive impact. So measuring people's activity would be one thing. I would want to measure people's sleep and make sure that they're getting sleep. Sleep is a very important restorative time and has implications on cancer risk. I would want to measure people's stress response so that people get some understanding of what and when they're perceiving stress and how that's being taken up physiologically by their bodies to give them an opportunity to interrupt that cycle. And I think looking at diet, and if there was a way to really assess people's dietary intake from a from kind of two perspectives, from the perspective of what's the glycemic load of this diet overall. That would be one perspective, and then the other would be what nutrients does this diet contain that we know are cancer preventative. And so if we could measure those things, I think we would be well on our way to giving people a lot of very empowering information that they could then manipulate on a daily basis to lower their risk.
Yeah. Well, I've got some good news for you. Most of those things are available right now. I've seen them, and they are sort of, some probably all in different devices right now. But I think what we're going to see is a conglomeration, people developing more things, and obviously, once Apple gets involved with it and has something that everyone uses, we'll see a lot more of that. But I can tell you, the sleep, the stress, the food, all of that is already happening, and I'm very excited because we're going to see at the moment most of this technology is sort of healthy 30-year-olds making apps for other healthy 30-year-olds. But I see that obviously over time it'll go into other areas of the of the world and other areas of the population. But what I'm really excited about is, yes, these things already exist, and I think that there are people out there who will get passionate about this kind of work, who have the skills to be able to develop these kind of things. And I think very soon we will see cancer-specific apps where people who think they might have a diagnosis or have a diagnosis, will do that. So it's good news.
Yes,
it's the last thing I want to just focus on and just get your thoughts on, because I know that this is a topic that's been in the news now. Because one of the other things that's happening is we're getting a lot more genetic information. You're seeing Angelina Jolie, having a double mastectomy preemptively because she has the gene for it. For all those people who are thinking of doing that and thinking that that is the way forward, as a result of this conversation, what would you say to them right now?
Yeah, that's a very interesting and challenging discussion. But, the reality is that Angelina Jolie has lowered her risk significantly for developing breast cancer. She was at very high lifetime risk of developing breast cancer. So she has adopted a strategy which is hard to argue. I think what's missing in that conversation is that women are essentially told that if they have this BRCA mutation, their only option is to have prophylactic mastectomies or oophorectomies, which is ovarian removal. And there's nothing in that conversation about all of the other lifestyle-based prevention strategies, which we know lower risk of breast cancer even in BRCA1 and BRCA2 carriers. So, maybe if somebody is facing that decision and they were told, you could have these surgeries, and another option is that we could put you on a very tight screening program, and you could change your diet, change your stress levels, start exercising, and reduce the expression of that gene. Then I think we're looking at potentially a third option, and something that I believe women should be empowered to be able to choose.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, more people are becoming aware of it. I really appreciate all of the work that you're doing, and I really appreciate our time together. I think anyone who listens to this would have learned something, and certainly something to take away or share with other people. It seems like just by the path that we're going now, it's only going to be more and more people that this is going to be affected by. But I think what you've spoken about here is really the seeds to have a more sustainable strategy to deal with this epidemic plight that we're seeing. Dr. Alschuler's website is DRLISE, drlise.net, and you can find out more about her work from there. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure spending this time with you, and look forward to our ongoing and future connections.
Well, thank you so much, James. I appreciate the time as well.
Thank you so much. Take care. This has been the World Summit for the Evolution of Medicine. This was the Evolution of Oncology. It's been myself, James Maskell, with Dr. Lise Alschuler, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.